Well, let me welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. I'm very impressed that such a large number of people made it out on a very hot day, but then we've got a very hot topic to talk about, so maybe they go right together. My name's Kent Hughes. I run a program here at the Wilson Center on America and the global economy, and also oversee our Global Energy Initiative and our Wilson Center on the Hill program. For those of you who are new to the Wilson Center, let me say just a word or two about the center itself. We were established in 1968 by an act of Congress. They were looking for a way to honor the 28th President, Woodrow Wilson, and they decided against one more monument or one more marble statue, and instead decided to try to create a living memorial that would focus on bringing together both sides of Wilson's life. As you may know, Wilson is the only president to have earned a PhD. And in his era, he was a very prominent political scientist. In fact, yesterday we had a book discussion about a new book on the Congress, and the author, in fact, quoted Woodrow Wilson in his first book on, which was entitled Congressional Government. And what they wanted us to do is then to bring together not only the academic side of his life, but the work he did as a two-term president, and of course he was also governor of New Jersey. So what we try to do is to bring together the best thinkers on public policy, together with people like yourselves who are also thinking about public policy, but making it, influencing it, and helping it actually happen. And this is just that kind of conference we have this morning. We have flanked by two top thinkers on the question of biofuels. This is a timely topic. As you saw, Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid announced his intent to move an energy bill yesterday. This is a subject that's of considerable importance. If we were at the Department of Defense, they'd be thinking about the possible use of algae as a long-term source for fuel in their drive to be energy self-sufficient. It involves a lot of work on innovation, involves our innovation system. And as our two principal authors will point out, it really has implications for food security, for the environment, and really for in many ways, you could say, the future of the planet. Well, it's now my pleasure to introduce our two initial speakers. To my right and your left, I have C. Ford Runge. Ford is a distinguished professor at the University of Minnesota. He also has positions in the Department of Forestry and at the Hubert Humphrey Institute for Public Affairs, Public Policy.
Public Affairs, yes.
Ford is really been a student of biofuels. We have drawn on his thinking in the past, and he's looked at this from a variety of perspectives, and I think you'll find his points interesting, pointed, and very much thought-provoking. He, like Wilson, has engaged in the public policy field more actively, not just as a scholar, but worked, as I remember, on the House Agriculture Committee one time and had been engaged with AID. Our other lead speaker, to my left, Robin Johnson, has had a very distinguished career at Cargill, which is a privately owned company that absolutely has a global footprint. Not surprisingly, he's continued to think about the world of agriculture, including the question of biofuels. He is now president of the Cargill Foundation and also a senior advisor at the Hubert Humphrey Institute, appropriately enough, for global policy studies. I want to point out that both of these gentlemen have a very distinguished academic record, and in fact, both of them were Rhodes Scholars. So you have a panel here made up of two Rhodes Scholars and a country boy from Oregon. Ford, let me turn the floor over to you.
Thank you. Our plan this morning is to provide a brief presentation, in which I'll do the first part and Robin the second, and then to open the floor for discussion, which I think is always more interesting. So let me begin by making a few remarks. I don't see very many people that I've seen here before, but we've actually been here several times to sort of provide briefings on biofuels as the issues and questions have evolved. And I suppose it would be fair to say that although both Robin and I are quite hopeful about the possibilities for innovation in this area, we are also somewhat skeptical of the relative importance that biofuels will play in the national energy portfolio, and to some extent have been quite critical of the level of subsidy and government expenditure that's been put into this area relative to what we've gotten out of it. But we'll get into some of those details soon. Policies surrounding biofuels in the United States remain controversial and much debated. In the months since BP's catastrophic deepwater oil rig explosion, the international debate over energy, ever inclined to drift on the wind of current events, has been captured by this fiasco in the Gulf and the environmental destruction from the errors of BP, Transocean, and Halliburton. Knowing not how to respond, politicians, including President Obama, have called for new, non-petroleum-based, quote, clean, unquote, energy. We shall argue today that this raises the broader question of how not only to design a full portfolio of energy choices in the U.S., including the role of biofuels, but also how best to think through energy portfolio choices. And so our review will examine the state of play in both spheres. In particular, it's our view that the tragedy in the Gulf, which should not be underrated, in no way condones the excessive and indefensible subsidies to the biofuel sector. It does, however, afford an opportunity to rethink the role of government policy in the interface between energy and climate change. Later on, I'm going to have a slide which is very hard to see, and so I've prepared a handout. Has that gone around? Which shows the cost of abating a unit of CO2 across a range of options. And if you turn this on its end, it's much easier to look at than the slide itself on a PowerPoint presentation. But in effect, what this shows us is what the portfolio selection problem or choice is for energy policy in the United States. And it shows us these choices in relation to the cost of each of the technologies to abate a given unit of CO2. This is based on data drawn from McKinsey and Company. Don't be misled by the association with Greenpeace in the lower right-hand corner. And was prepared by Doug Koplow, an analyst at EarthTrack in Cambridge, Massachusetts. But what one can see on the left-hand side of this array of technologies is that simple investments in things like lighting upgrades and fuel economy are actually negative cost interventions. They pay for themselves in terms of abating a unit of CO2. As we move from left to right in this array, we see that eventually we come up to and eventually cross some of the offset values that have been set in markets for carbon trading until we rise above those levels and begin to come into what are the highest cost interventions to abate a unit of CO2. And those are highlighted in red on the right-hand side. As you can see, they begin in red with subsidies to new nuclear power, go on to subsidies to cellulosic ethanol, the total cost of new nuclear power plants, and then jump up at the highest levels to subsidies to biodiesel, displacing diesel, and finally, the least cost-effective intervention to reduce a unit of CO2 in this array, subsidies to corn ethanol, displacing gasoline. Now, it's notable that the energy legislation that's under consideration focuses especially on two of these technologies and proposes to spend taxpayer dollars to provide guarantees for the construction of new nuclear plants and to provide additional subsidies to the biofuels sector. What's notable and salient about these proposals is that they suggest that public policy in America is moving toward two of the least cost-effective methods that we know for abating CO2. The pall cast over America's energy future by the spill in the Gulf has worked in odd ways. On the one hand, petroleum extraction and consumption, upon which the entire industrial enterprise is clearly staked for now and in the reasonably foreseeable future, has risks. We knew about air pollution and climate hazards of an oil economy, but the risks of undersea extraction were largely ignored. The reaction to what has happened in the Gulf indirectly seems to endorse alternative energy. But the irony is that well before the BP disaster, the use of petroleum-based nitrogen fertilizer to grow corn, nearly a third of which now goes to make ethanol, had polluted the Gulf of Mexico. Let me show you a slide that describes at the end of May, the extent of the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. This extent has not changed appreciably since, and of course much is unknown about the extent of undersea pollution because of the dispersants that have been applied. But this, in a geographic sense, gives a feel for the range of impacts as of the end of May. Now, ocean currents are carrying these oil and tar balls more far afield, but especially at the delta of the Mississippi River, which is shown by this by the promontory in sort of the upper middle portion of the diagram, is where the most important effects are likely to occur in Gulf ecosystems. This is a satellite photograph of what is referred to in technical terms as the hypoxic or dead zone of the Gulf of Mexico. And again, the promontory on the right-hand side of this slide is the Mississippi Delta. This dead zone was created and has been created by the outflow of nitrogen primarily and phosphorus into the Gulf of Mexico, which has encouraged aquatic plant growth, which has in turn led to a depletion in the levels of oxygen in the waters of the Gulf, and consequently has made it difficult for ocean life to exist all along this dead zone. In 2007-2008, at the height of corn production for the purposes of meeting demands, in part, for ethanol, this dead zone expanded to its largest extent in the 25 histories in which it's been measured, and now approximately is the size of the state of New Jersey. So long before the spill in the Gulf, corn production in the Midwest, estimates by the U.S. Geological Survey suggest that the majority of the nitrogen that flows into the Gulf of Mexico has its origins above the confluence of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. So it's coming off classic corn belt acres in Illinois, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and so on, had an impact on the ecology of the Gulf that was widely acknowledged by those who understand ocean ecology as having been devastating. And it's interesting because nitrogen fertilizer, which is its primary cause, is made from natural gas. After the surge in plantings in 2007, the expansion of this dead zone thus had already come as one externality or consequence of the application of hydrocarbons, in this case, to grow corn. Let me turn now briefly to the basis of policy in the biofuels sector. U.S. biofuels policy is predicated on 5 main pillars. The first is a 45-cent a gallon blender's credit, which is passed through to producers. This was reduced from 51 cents in the 2008 Farm Bill, and there is currently a kind of schism inside the ethanol community over the possibility of reducing it further. Actually, it's a little more complicated. The blender's credit paid to cellulosic ethanol is actually $1.01. In addition to this blender's credit, which can be thought of as a sort of price support, a 54-cent a gallon tariff is imposed on imported ethanol. This was extended from 2010 to 2012 in the 2008 Farm Bill. Why is there a 54-cent a gallon tariff on imported ethanol? Because Brazil can produce sugar cane-based ethanol at roughly half the cost of corn-based ethanol in the United States. So to be competitive, we must protect our domestic industry with this tariff wall. As a matter of trade policy, it's interesting that we have taken a commodity, number 2 yellow feed corn, in which we are indisputably the world's leader with a strong comparative advantage, and converted it into a commodity, ethanol, in which it's necessary to impose a 54-cent a gallon tariff in order to maintain the structure of the industry, thus demonstrating our comparative disadvantage. We were talking before the break about these policies, and point was made, well, the political economy is easy to understand. And I said, well, for many years I've heard political economy trotted out as an explanation for what might also be called equals stupid. The third pillar of U.S. policy relates to the mandates, the fuel mandates that have required blending ethanol at increasingly higher levels as years go by. And there's a schedule for these mandates that goes out to the year 2020, by which time 36 billion gallons are to be blended, of which 21 billion are to be cellulosic ethanol. That is to say, based on the conversion of commodities like switchgrass or wood chips or some other non-food commodity to fuel. President Obama has proposed raising this mandate to 60 billion gallons by 2030. Finally, there are a panoply of subsidies to cellulosic pilot plants and more to probably be included in subsequent farm and energy legislation. While mandates replace market signals, the federal blenders tax credits provide added subsidies to the sector and distort those signals. Koplow, the analyst that I mentioned earlier in Cambridge, has estimated what the potential fiscal implications of these subsidies and mandates are out to 2020 and beyond to 2030 if the Obama plan, as it's called, for 60 billion gallons is implemented. Let me point out, by the way, that to give this some scale representation, even if every bushel of corn produced in the United States were dedicated to biofuels, it would support only about 15% of vehicular energy needs. Currently, about a third of the U.S. corn crop is being used to produce ethanol. So the schedule of subsidies and ethanols running out to 2022 increases in direct proportion to the volumes of ethanol and biodiesel that are produced. And as you can see, the plan is that cellulosic biofuels will increasingly displace corn-based ethanol as time goes by. But the subsidy implications of this plan, if one can call it that, are quite sobering. If current laws are maintained until 2022, the biofuels industry will receive more than $60 billion a year, a six-fold increase over the $9.5 billion received in 2008. Cumulative subsidies to the sector between 2018 and 2022 are expected to total $420 billion. If the Obama plan mandating 60 billion gallons by 2030 comes to pass, subsidies in that year will be $125 billion, and cumulative support from 2008 to 2030 will be in excess of $1 trillion. That's a lot of money to throw at a marginal contributor to vehicular fuel needs. In principle, the mandated blending of biofuels is to switch from corn-based ethanol, which tops out at a mandated 15 billion gallons, to cellulosic alternatives. But before I talk about the impacts of all of these developments on price, let me point out that in this year, mandated cellulosic blends had to be reduced by 95% because the commercially available cellulosic fuel wasn't being produced. In May of 2010, USDA issued a critical assessment of the difficulties of cellulosic alternatives. U.S. production capacity for these cellulosic fuels was estimated to be only 10 million gallons this year, compared to the 100 million gallons that were mandated for 2010 in 2007 energy legislation. The costs of cellulosic ethanol are estimated to be at a minimum, in using current technology, twice those of corn-based ethanol. And the USDA report indicated that these costs can rise to as much as 3 or 4 times those of corn-based ethanol. So the report noted that the costs of growing feedstocks for cellulosic plants are probably underestimates, and that, quoting, the dedicated energy crops would need to compete with the lowest value crop, such as hay, which has a price exceeding $100 a ton in 2007. The leading commercial cellulosic ethanol producer in America, Fiberite, is expected to have a production capacity of 130 barrels a day in 2010. Even a small oil refinery produces 60,000 barrels a day. Production capacity for cellulosic biofuel is forecasted by USDA at 291 million gallons by 2012. That's quite an increase in 2 years. Compared, though, with a mandated level of 1,000 million tons. So roughly 1/3 of what will be mandated under legislation. So as a result of these costs and production shortfalls, Koplow describes what he calls a bizarre policy dynamic. The government will need to boost subsidies to cellulosic crops enough so the return to farmers is higher than that from federally subsidized corn, which they are currently growing. From the taxpayer's point of view, he writes, this is the equivalent of betting against oneself in a card game. In an open letter to the President, dated June 16th, the Renewable Fuels Association, a lobbying arm of the industry, noted that Obama's June 15th address from the Oval Office on energy failed to mention biofuels and proposed several measures to reinforce existing subsidies. These included extending existing tax incentives, the blender's credit that I mentioned, raising ethanol blend levels from the current 10% to 12% and ultimately 15% or higher, mandating the production of flexible fuel vehicles, and offering new loan guarantees to cellulosic ethanol producers. Well, in our previous analysis of the impacts of biofuels policy, beginning especially in the middle of the last decade, about 2004, 2005, we noted the fact that the demand for corn to make ethanol was beginning to ration corn for the purposes of feed and food. And despite record production increases and harvests in the mid-2000s and the expectation this year of an extraordinary harvest, the price of corn marched steadily upward from 2006 to reach a high in late 2008, from which it's since come down. But it's my conviction that the price of corn, despite the record harvest, has achieved a new rough equilibrium somewhere between $3.50 and $4, substantially above its levels of 2004, 2005, and that this will be the prevailing price at which it trades going forward. Why? Well, it's difficult to imagine that a demandeur such as the ethanol industry, that now accounts for a third of total consumption of corn, has not had something to do with this. Early in June, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN noted that although the FAO Food Price Index fell from 174 points in January 2010 to 164 points in May, it still remains 69% higher than in 2004. So the consequences of increases in the price of maize, as it's known internationally, or corn and other commodities, has had impacts around the world. Now, in previous briefings and discussions, and in an article I published with my co-author Ben Senauer in Foreign Affairs in 2007, which was entitled How Biofuels May Starve the Poor, we focused specifically on the developing country implications of biofuels. But we're not going to dwell on that issue as much today as on some of the environmental issues. And I'll simply say that U.S. biofuels policy has certainly had a global impact, not just a national one. Especially the decision in 2007 to double the corn-based ethanol mandate from 7.5 billion gallons to 15 billion gallons, which pushed global fuel use of grain sharply upward, since America accounts for nearly 90% of world ethanol consumption, about half of production, which it shares with Brazil. As a result, grains used for biofuels reached 125 million tons in 2009-10, with annual growth rates in the three preceding years of 15, 24, and 36%, compared to non-industrial demand growth, which averaged about 2% a year. Roughly 8% of global grain production is now committed to heavily subsidized fuel use. So at this point, I'd like to turn to my colleague Rob Johnson. I have a few more slides to share with you, but I think that he's going to take over now and talk a little bit about some of the energy policy issues and touch on some of the environmental questions that challenge us in this area.
Well, thank you, Ford. I think the burden of what Ford and I have said at previous sessions and this morning is that biofuels policy in the United States to date has basically been farm policy masquerading as energy policy. And what we would like to do is sort of entertain the notion that after a third of a century of pursuit of biofuels as farm policy, the future is more likely to be shaped by the role that it can play constructively in a broader energy policy in this country. Now, we cannot, in the time we have, construct a very detailed framework for how to evaluate U.S. energy policies, and I didn't bring a slide because I actually thought of this on the airplane coming down. But I have tried to draw up on the whiteboard there a simple framework. Basically what it is a 2x2 matrix. It says on one axis, the vertical axis, you've got energy choices, and I've divided them simply into two categories: energy usage or energy source. Usage is fuel in the car. Source is what type of fuel in the car. And along the horizontal axis, I've put the cost of greenhouse gas reductions. And so, again, to simplify it, you've got low-cost strategies and you've got high-cost strategies. What I have tried to suggest in filling in the boxes is that if you're looking for a low-cost strategy for changing energy sources, by and large, that's going to be what I'm calling a decarbonizing strategy. You migrate from energy sources that have high carbon content, like wood and coal, toward energy sources that have lower carbon content, like petroleum and ultimately natural gas, and then beyond, the so-called clean alternatives. On the usage box, clearly, and the Koplo chart that Ford put up at the beginning is a perfect illustration of this. Conservation is easily the lowest cost greenhouse gas reduction strategy we have, and almost all of the bars that are below the horizontal line in Koplo's, in other words, that return more than they cost, are conservation strategies. In the energy use category, high cost, I've put carbon capture and sequestration. Some might argue that that's a source strategy, not a use strategy, but I think really what it is, okay, we've got all these coal-fired plants, how can we make their use more compatible with greenhouse gas reductions? And the technology and the economics are such that that's a very high-cost strategy. On the source side, as Ford indicated, corn-based ethanol, CBE, is a very high-cost strategy for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So if you want to follow along with my comments, it starts on page 7 of the paper that we left outside. What I tried to do was to pose sort of the notion, if we were to have a debate about where do biofuels fit into a rational U.S. energy strategy going forward, there are 7 or 8 questions that are, I think, worth posing. The first, and the one that is set up probably most strikingly by the presentation that Ford made, is the excessive costliness of U.S. biofuels policies. And as we, as a country, face into the looming deficits, it is possible that people will begin to question a strategy that relies heavily on operating subsidies that grow as the industry being subsidized grows, and may sort of reopen the question of shouldn't the government's role rather be that of investing in public goods and encouraging innovation and least cost kinds of solutions. With respect to energy policy regulation, Ford's presentation emphasized the large role that mandates have played in U.S. biofuels policy. I'd just do one quick aside. If you go back prior to 2006, the industry was growing very rapidly because refiners were forced initially to take lead out of gasoline and then to take MTBE out of gasoline, and ethanol was the only convenient oxygenate that was available to slide in there. And so in that period, ethanol earned a premium over gasoline and moved into that market created by the RFG mandates very nicely, and processing margins were very large. And it was that large processing margin driven by the premium additive market plus the decisions to escalate the mandates that drew a lot of investment capital into the industry in the second half of the first decade of this century, which has driven processing margins down to 1/3 the level they were prior to 2006, and likely to keep margins at that level going forward. So the industry is, in a sense, by shifting from oxygenate additive that was a premium market to a fuel extender, which is a discounted market because of its lower energy content, the industry has priced itself into the bottom end of the value-added chain rather than the higher end. But on the regulatory issue, if you think that mandates or artificial demand generators like that aren't necessarily in the industry's long-term best interest, it may be that people will begin to reconsider the role of mandates in an energy policy. And if and when we have the next food price spike that's driven by the structure of biofuels policy, I think that point will sharpen in the public debate. On alternative energy sources, as the Koplo table indicated, biofuels clearly is a very inefficient replacement of petroleum as an energy source. There are all kinds of cheaper transportation fuels. The ones that are coming to market right now, of course, are electric vehicles in the form of hybrids, but eventually in the form of fully battery-powered vehicles. But it's also a very high-cost strategy for greenhouse gas reductions. And as the pressure mounts on policymakers to formulate an energy strategy that also results in greenhouse gas reductions, I think the role of biofuels will again face some serious reconsideration. Ford talked a little bit about the environmental pollution problems that are attached to the industry. The clearest one, of course, is the nitrogen runoff and the eutrophication at the Gulf of Mexico. More contentious has been the discussion around the pressure that biofuels policies in the United States are creating on conversion of land into cropping, and the burden that it places on water, which is increasingly a scarce resource. That issue plus the nitrous oxide emissions that mount as fertilization intensifies may change the public perception of biofuels as a clean energy source. And in fact, I think one of the previous presentations we made was titled "The Browning of Biofuels," and it drove harder on that point. In any kind of energy policy debate, inevitably we're going to have to focus on longer-term solutions. The biggest problem beyond cost and inefficiency that biofuels face is that because of the water solubility issues, it requires a separate distribution system. And it seems to me that it would be very difficult for the United States to rationally agree on a long-term energy policy that requires not only the destruction of the initial or the existing distribution system over time, but the construction of an entirely separate channel. Next generation biofuels, the supposed promise of the successor to corn-based ethanol. Ford's talked a little bit about the economic barriers that need to be overcome for cellulosic ethanol. But there's also this whole question of is the corn-based ethanol industry really a bridge to cellulosic, or is it a barrier? From what I understand of the technologies, the most promising technologies in cellulosic are chemical-based, not fermentation-based, so that the plants that are being built for corn-based ethanol are not likely to be directly useful, that the sourcing of the feedstocks is unlikely to be in prime cropland, but in marginal production areas or areas tributary to urban centers if you use urban waste. So the plants aren't located appropriately to build that bridge. And as Ford pointed out, they emerge as highly subsidized competition for the growth of a new cellulosic type industry. The last, I think, practical question that arises with, if you think about the role of biofuels as an energy solution rather than as a farm policy initiative, is that the market that it was intended to serve is changing. I remember when we were initially looking at the projections of gasoline use in the United States, they rose inexorably. Now people understand that 2007 was probably the peak use of gasoline in the United States, and that gasoline use is going to be trending downward rather than upward going forward, by and large because of the increased fuel efficiencies that are being both introduced for economic reasons and driven by new fuel mandates themselves. So now you have a market that is not growing but shrinking. You have a strategy around greenhouse gas emissions that is going to become more important rather than less important. And how does the notion of driving ethanol use, production and use, up against a market that is being reshaped dramatically by market forces that weren't built into that initial model, isn't that likely to prompt some sort of reconsideration of the whole role of ethanol and biodiesel in our long-term energy future? So, quickly to conclude and hopefully to then open the floor up to your questions. We tried to conclude this paper with sort of two sets of ideas. One is, what would you do to try to ease the transition from current biofuels policy to a more sustainable long-term strategy? And we've suggested essentially three steps in that process. The first is to cap the mandate, stop digging the hole deeper. Second, to change the nature and perhaps phase out the subsidies. The phase out would be the most effective answer because it would signal to the industry that at some point it has to stand on its own. But if that is unrealistic and there remains sort of a residual farm policy component to this strategy, we suggest changing the nature of the subsidies so that they are counter-cyclical. They rise when corn surpluses increase and they shrink when corn surpluses disappear. And third, if you are serious about a constructive role for biofuels in U.S. energy future, then you have to be able to tap into the lowest cost global sources, which means getting rid of the 54-cent a gallon import duty and encouraging the development of low-cost ethanol production wherever it can be done. On the energy policy front, just again, a few quick suggestions about the government's role in U.S. energy future, and we again suggest sort of three ideas. The highest return on government expenditures in this area is going to come from investments in R&D rather than where they have started out in operating subsidies. Second, to place more attention than has been placed in the policy debate today on energy losses that occur in the production, transportation, and distribution of energy. I'll let you mention your Tesla suggestion on that one. But finally, going back to the Koplo graphic, invest much more on the conservation incentive side. Those are where the gains are the cheapest and most immediately accessible, in most cases available with current technologies. So I'll stop there, and Kent will throw it open.
That's great. Thank you very much, Robin. We're open for questions. If you would please wait until the microphone arrives. We're recording this and webcasting this. And if you would please then identify yourself. There's a gentleman right here in the front, Clark.
Thank you. I'm Don Crane with the International Fertilizer Development Center. Dr. Johnson, I'm wondering, have you or anyone you know of gone back to the previous price spike to sort of disaggregate the causes? Because you talked about being driven by biofuel, but there's increasing demand in China and India, crop failure, commodity speculation, and other factors. So has anybody looked at what was the effect isolated of the biofuel?
Yes. Actually, we spent a good part of the last presentation here at the Woodrow Wilson Center on that topic. And I think what you have to sort out are sort of two sets of forces. There are some long-term forces at work. Growing population, growing prosperity, shifting diets to more resource-intensive kinds of diets, which put more stress on crop production. And at the same time that demand has been growing, there has been a slowdown in the rate of growth in crop yields. So that, yes, in the first part of the 20th century, most years we were consuming more grains than we were producing because those two lines were beginning to converge a little bit. There also was, for a part of that period, an increase in energy prices, which pushed up production costs. So those are some of the long-term trends. On the other hand, there were two things that operated in that late 2007, 2008 period that drove prices to spike quite as dramatically as they did. And those two things were the ramp up in the ethanol mandates in the United States. Ford had mentioned that the initial mandate had been 7.5 billion gallons by 2012, and in 2007 we were at about 6 billion gallons. Well, the mandate ramp-up jumped that to 9, 10, and 11 billion gallons in successive years. So that ramp went up just when the long-term forces were converging. And then secondly, in the absence of trade agreements that discipline exporters, a number of countries impose price controls and export controls to protect domestic consumers at the expense of the world market, which put further stress. So I'd say that, yes, you had some long-term pressures that were that would have, in the absence of anything else, forced a need to increase either yields or to begin to slow down the rate of growth of demand. But that if you talk about the two policy mistakes that were made that really caused the spike, they were the increase in the ethanol mandates and the imposition of export and price controls.
Can I just add to that briefly?
Please.
You know, there has been quite a bit of sparring and disputation in academic and policy circles about how much of the blame, in effect, for price spikes should fall to ethanol. And the estimates cover a remarkable range. At one point, my friend Joe Glauber was put up by the Secretary of Agriculture to go and assert before the Senate that biofuels had to do with about 2% of it. And an analyst named Mitchell at the World Bank published a report almost coterminously that attributed roughly 75% of the increase to biofuels. Working with the International Food Policy Research Institute's impact model, I and several colleagues came to the conclusion that it might have been in the range of 25 to 30% of the total, which at least had the virtue of being between the two extrema. But the truth is that no one knows for sure. But the point I want to make is that of the many forces and causes that Robin just described, the mandates were a choice. They weren't the result of general growth patterns. They weren't the result of climate or weather. They weren't the result of economic growth, which I think all of us would probably endorse, or most of us. They were a choice. And the sort of fundamental point we're making is that they were a choice that if we think that price spikes are not a good thing, especially for the world's poor, was an ill-advised choice. And that's the rationale behind Robin's suggestion that the mandates be frozen.
So the gentleman there, and the gentleman there, and then the lady there.
Thank you. My name is John Mattel, and I just had a question about using cellulosic ethanol. I grow some trees, and the price of pulp is low, as you know. Why can't we just make them into chips, burn them where they are, turn them into electricity, rather than turn them into a cellulose? And would that be much more efficient? I think it would be, but thank you.
Yes.
Robin and I were talking at breakfast about Cargill's decision to burn soybean oil directly in some of its boilers. For what purpose, I'm not sure, but somewhere in Iowa. But the shorter the path from the feedstock to its conversion into BTUs in general, the lower the cost and the greater the efficiency. So wherever we can kind of shorten that path, I think we should.
I'm Kip Davis from the Department of Energy. I'm an analyst. If we don't use biofuels, then we need another substitute, and you mentioned electric vehicles and using electricity as the alternative fuel. I'm trying to set this question up. We have to pay subsidies for that. There'll be an infrastructure cost. We don't have the batteries we need yet. There'll be back-end costs related to the batteries, such as disposal and recycling. There may be resource constraints, like limited lithium or rare earth metal supplies that are needed for these batteries, and so on and so on, so on and so forth. So the path to that being a substitute is perhaps as difficult as the case for biofuels. So can you comment on that and perhaps tell us where we need to go? What is the substitute ultimately?
Well, again, let me try and sort of break that question into two parts. The first part is, what's the government's role in answering that question? And I think the burden of what we're trying to argue, it is not to pick answers and then to subsidize the operating costs of those answers. It would be much more cost effective and I think more appropriate to the role of government to encourage research and innovation at the front end of bringing down the costs of the alternatives. So from a policy strategy standpoint, that's where I would focus. If you're talking about migration from kind of where we are today, I mean, over what kind of time horizon are we talking about? It is unlikely, it seems to me, that we are going to replace petroleum as a transportation fuel for several decades. And that changes, it seems to me, sort of the framework in which that market ought to operate. And so the initiatives that both governments and private manufacturers are making to make vehicles more fuel efficient is a better, low-cost, short-term alternative, because if you double the mileage, you've gained much more than you have by converting the corn crop into ethanol.
Just a brief addition. You're completely right to emphasize that no matter what technology we choose to pursue for the purposes of meeting national energy needs, there will be costs, there will be externalities, and there will be capital expenditure requirements that are very substantial. So there really is no free lunch here, and one of the sort of great illusions of the biofuels mania of the middle of the last decade was that there really was a free lunch, that we could just grow all this stuff, whether it was corn or switchgrass or whatever, and convert it to fuel and keep running our flex fuel suburban vehicles, and everything would be fine. It would be green, it would be clean, and it would be homegrown. And, you know, I think we, among others, were among the first to say, well, you know, to fill the tank of an SUV with ethanol will require enough corn to feed a poor family in a developing country for a year. So the trade-off is there from fuel to food, and as you rightly point out, the trade-offs are there from fuel to fuel. And we should be realists and begin to try to rank these alternatives and to put money into investing in reducing their costs over time. But for the foreseeable future, the reality is that the industrial enterprise is predicated on petroleum-based fuels.
Lady next, and then we'll go to the gentleman far in the back, and then the gentleman closer to the front.
I'm Mitzi Wertheim. I'm with the Naval Postgraduate School, but I created a program back in '06 called the Energy Conversation here in Washington, which was funded by the Defense Department, the single largest user of fuel in the world, or single largest buyer. I'm a social anthropologist. I'm not, and I'm struck by how complex these stories are. And as I listened to your stories, I kept wanting to watch them visually. And my suggestion to you is that you get with some visual artists and get them to basically show the flow of this and what the costs are depending on the choices. There's some if you've never seen any of Ed Tufte's books on visualizing information, this is so complex. I mean, I know a lot about what you're talking, and I couldn't follow everything. I mean, so if you want to communicate this to policy writers and makers, they don't have any time to learn all this detail. And so you have to present it. I mean, if you remember when Eisenhower was president, everything had to be on one page, single-spaced. And boy, is that hard. But I think if you want to get your ideas across, you're going to have to link up with others that can help you tell your story so the listener that you want to reach gets it.
Just let me say, I have a colleague at the University of Minnesota who has actually done pretty much what you're describing. He's developed a simulation model, an interactive simulation model with visual displays of quantitative information. They used Tufte's original title. And it's very user-friendly. And if his last name is Taft, T-A-F-F. But such programs and tools are being developed, and his is among the best.
How do we find that website?
I guess I would probably contact S. Taft at umn.edu, universityofminnesota.edu, and ask him. It's in the public domain, and there's nothing proprietary about this software, and I'm sure he would share it with you.
Let me just intervene. Thank you for your question. That we hope to do a publication around this, and I'll take your advice and see if we can't add some visual lessons to complement the insights of our two authors.
Mm-hmm. And most people in this city don't have time to read. I will tell you, I had Mike Mullen, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, for dinner about 6 years ago, and I'd been asked to rethink education policy for the Department of Defense. And I had 3 pages of just bullets, and I wanted Mike to look at it because he wasn't chairman at that point. And his comment to me was, Mitzi, if it takes more than 5 minutes, I'll never look at it. And I think academics have to learn how to have a document. I mean, you can write your long documents for your academic friends, but for the receivers, you need to write something that the policymakers can read, understand, and know what to do. And it's bloody hard. And you ought to get your students, they can write their long papers, but their final exam ought to be something that their grandmothers could understand.
Very good.
Dan Pearson from the U.S. International Trade Commission. You've suggested backing away from current policies that provide incentives for the use of agricultural commodities for fuel. Have you had a chance to take the next step and consider the implications for the global agricultural economy of dealing with what then would be a structural surplus for production of grains and oilseeds relative to demand? Is there a possibility that demand would rise from other uses to meet the supply that's there? What type of adjustments might you foresee?
Well, I hate to keep going first, Ford. You got to step in here at some point, but let me try. I guess I would answer the question this way. We don't have a market-driven structural surplus. What we have is the potential structural surplus created by a set of artificial incentives. I said that non-industrial use of feed grains globally is growing at a roughly 2% a year, a little over the population growth rate. Population plus income to upgrade diets is sort of the fundamental trend rate. And the longer term trend rate on yields, in fact, has been dropping, and I think corn yield growth over the last decade has been, in spite of it being relatively strong, is still under 2%. So I don't think that we clearly have a long-term structural surplus situation. What we have is an artificial demand that has been created by government policies that needs to be unwound so that the market can be handed back to market forces. And the three parts of our strategy are designed to do that. Freeze the mandates so that at least the mandates don't keep rising. Second, convert the subsidy to one that increases if surpluses build up, so that you still have the capacity to remove surplus corn by pushing it into industrial uses. And third, create an open global market and let the market over time, through production and trade flows, sort out that surplus. I think it's a reasonable balance of interests. It's not going to be painless, but I think it's a reasonable strategy.
One nice thing about your going first, Robin, is it gives me a chance to think. But I promise to go first next time, so you can think. Not that you didn't give a thoughtful response.
Yes, please be careful there.
Yeah. But Dan, I think what Rob said is important. You understand this. Your question, in effect, implied that a structural surplus would be generated and seemed almost to assume a rollback in the mandate. What we're proposing is a freeze in the mandate. So that should have less of a jarring effect of the sort that you were describing. Beyond that, most analysis of international commodities markets today suggests a huge pent-up demand, still unmet, for meat consumption, especially in Asia. And I would expect that even if some surpluses were generated as a consequence of freezing the mandate, that they would quickly be taken up as a result of demand for livestock feed. That would be my conjecture, and it's a conjecture.
I think the gentleman here was next, and then we'll go to the gentleman there, and then there was a hand over here. I saw the gentleman. Yes. No, I think it was a gentleman here, Clark, was next, and then we'll go to that gentleman in the back.
Thank you, Connor Branch for CSAS. I just had a quick question about the mandates you were speaking about, cellulosic ethanol, and given the slow ramp-up speeds of production and even given the subsidy, what role do you see Brazil ethanol playing in sort of meeting that mandate, given the potential that the U.S. will sort of fail to meet domestic cellulosic targets?
In the next panel, we have a distinguished Brazilian participant who is probably in a much better position to answer that question than I am. But if I understood your question, the implication seemed to be that if we were to drop the tariff, that the sugar-based ethanol would qualify as cellulosic in meeting the mandate. I'm not sure of that, but I don't think so. So that Brazil's capacity to provide cellulosic ethanol to meet U.S. mandates, I think, is fairly limited. Now, I defer to our Brazilian, friends in answering that question. But I think that the argument that we were making for Brazilian for freeing up the capacity of the U.S. to import Brazilian sugar-based ethanol was a purely market-oriented and liberal trade perspective. Although there are kind of some practical logistical points as well. Most of the ethanol, which is almost all corn-based in the United States today, is produced in and around an epicenter more or less defined by Des Moines, Iowa. And in case you haven't noticed, that's not where most people live in the United States, nor drive. So the demand for ethanol as an added fuel or alternative fuel is largely on the coasts. It's in California, it's in New York, New Jersey, Florida, and so on. Brazilian sugar-based ethanol would be landed presumably at the Port of New Orleans, the Port of Norfolk, Port of San Diego, and so on, and so would therefore be in a position to provide a lower cost alternative for those people who are driving flex fuel vehicles, and would generally even out in a geographic sense the price discovery mechanism for that fuel in the United States. So there are some additional reasons why it would make sense to do that.
Well, let me just add a comment or two, since you've opened up the question of sort of the structure of mandates. I mean, Congress has got so much foresight that not only have they chosen to escalate ethanol use in total to 36 billion gallons, but they have called out the categories. And the notion that they can conjure up a cellulosic industry by calling out that category and escalating the production from that industry, it starts slowly, but by 2015 it's going up by 1.5 billion gallons a year. The total mandate is going up by 2.5 billion gallons a year, with no sense of either where that will come from or what it will cost. So we're suggesting that maybe this would be a good time to take a pause. The technology doesn't seem to be there. The economics, as portrayed in Ford's presentation, are daunting at best. Let's pause and reconsider this whole strategy.
So you're saying that, well, necessity is the mother of invention. You're suggesting that Congress is not.
Oh, I would never suggest that.
The gentleman in the back there.
Thank you. Carl Hausman from Bungie. This was an interesting presentation. I feel very comfortable with your 3 recommendations at the end, Rob, but I also have a feeling that the panel is more against biofuels than I think it should be. So let me explain myself. You said the government should support R&D. I also think there is a role for the government to prime the pump to see what opportunities exist out there. And at least the mandate for conventional biofuels from corn at 15 billion gallons it clearly has primed the pump. It has started an industry designed to do more than just reduce carbon emissions, but also to have alternate sources of fuel and to look for other opportunities. I do agree with you, though, that just because capping this current mandate is, I think, a good idea, because keep pushing it. Sometimes in Congress they might think more of a good thing is doubly as good, and sometimes too much of a good thing you really get in trouble with. So I like the idea of capping the mandate. I also think we should distinguish between mandates for biofuels that we know how to make from mandates from biofuels that we don't know how to make. There you were talking about the cellulosic, and that, I think, is really a slippery slope when you mandate something that people don't know how to do. With respect to the import tariff, the idea of eliminating it, I'd just be maybe a little bit more specific or a little bit careful about how we communicate that, because currently the support for corn-based ethanol has a 45% blender's credit, which is an incentive to a domestic industry. Should we be making that incentive available to foreign industries to look for alternate fuels? I question. So reducing the import tariff from the 54 cents down to the size of the current incentive, which is designed from our U.S. taxpayer money to incentivize a U.S. industry, not necessarily a Brazilian one, would make sense, but I don't see the need for the premium above the 45 cents to the 54 cents. But basically my question to you is, since I agree with your conclusions, I wonder why I'm getting a feeling you are more against the current structure of the corn-based ethanol effort by the government to look for alternative fuels than I think you should be.
Can I go first?
Absolutely.
Priming the pump is a somewhat ambiguous phrase. I agree with pouring a little gasoline on the carburetor from time to time, and I'm fundamentally a Keynesian, so I believe in aggressive macroeconomic policy and the idea of stimulus of the sort that we're pursuing now. But the basic problem that we see with the mandates, even at the level of 15 billion gallons of corn, is that priming the pump metamorphoses rather rapidly into an incentive problem that economists refer to as moral hazard. And that is to say that when the government stands ready to guarantee a market for a particular commodity, what do you think happens? People invest in satisfying that given demand. And because there's no uncertainty about the demand, there's a tendency to overinvest. And that's exactly what occurred in the corn ethanol business as a consequence of the 15 billion gallon corn ethanol mandate. Investments were made in plants which seemed to pan out given the mandate and given the fact that at the time that the mandate was first implemented, the price of corn was relatively low. But this became a nightmare when overcapacity in the industry, as a result of this moral hazard problem, caused margins to shrink to zero and to go into the red. In fact, the largest ethanol producer in America, Sun Corporation, went bankrupt about 18 months ago. So priming the pump can rapidly degenerate into a kind of moral hazard nightmare, and I think that was our main perspective.
I want to comment to Carl's question, if I may.
Yes, indeed.
If I have a few minutes. I think it's a very good one. I'll leave aside the prime the pump. I mean, a third of a century of priming the pump ought to be enough for the industry that we have. But I want to make an important distinction between the objections that we have to biofuels policy and our attitude toward biofuels. It is a very important distinction to make, and I have tried to be very clear that what I object to is the structure of biofuels policy in the United States, not at all to biofuels. In fact, I went out of my way to note that biofuels was playing a very important market function in the first part of this decade as an oxygenate. It was earning a premium in the market. It could have stood on its own. I mean, it was an industry that stood on its own because it was performing a value-added service. The Brazilian industry is an interesting one structurally because clearly what they are doing, they are the lowest cost sugar producer in the world. Unfortunately, sugar markets are artificially depressed by policies around the world, so they need to have some sort of internal balance wheel. And their sugar-based ethanol policy, to some extent, is a nice balance wheel to the artificial turbulence to sugar markets, and their inability to change that turbulence unilaterally. So what I'm trying to say is, as we look at and shape these commodity policies, that we ought to try to be more sensitive to market forces and a little less driven by arbitrary policy goals.
Let me just add that if we were having an innovation discussion, that many of my friends that focus on innovation policy would step back and, I think, agree with the general framework that the gentleman from Bunge has suggested, that if Gordon Moore, for instance, the origin of Moore's Law in semiconductors, were here, he would emphasize how important the Department of Defense was as becoming that first big customer that helped really get them going. So this relationship between an active innovation policy and the development of new technologies is complicated and very important, but not at all contradicting what the two professors here are suggesting with regard to mistaken or possibly mistaken biofuels policy. It's the gentleman over there.
Okay. Steve Hutchison. First, I'd like to applaud your call for conservation. It's certainly the most valuable thing we can do. And the second is your call for R&D, because I can tell you firsthand that there is no technology out there, at least on the biological side, that will convert cellulosic biomass into a fuel. The potential is there, but there's still a lot of R&D work that needs to be done to make that happen. So, and I had two places, though, where I do differ from you, being an entrepreneur where I've started a company and the impact on financing. And the two impacts have been that mandate and, number two, the tariffs on Brazilian or external fuels. The mandates are something that gives you market size. And market size means that you have a driving force for your technology to be applied, and therefore you're going to get some money back on it. And one of the driving forces that has helped us get started was the fact that there was such a large mandate for these fuels, even though it was a small fraction of what our current fuel consumption was. It was still that mandate was out there, and therefore you were going to have a market for a product, whatever fraction of that market share that you get. And so it was a very strong driving force, and I think people need to be aware that even though you've got an industry that's being developed, that you have to have that kind of driving force behind you. Whether you meet the mandates or not is not so critical. It's the fact that the mandate was there. On the other side, you've heard me say that converting cane sugar into fuel is by far the cheapest way of doing it. And if there's a cheaper alternative, I can tell you right now that the other people out there in the real world will go to whatever is cheapest today because they're myopic. They only look at what's close to them, and they are only interested in the next year. What we're trying to solve is a problem that's going to be 10 years, 15 years out. And so the driving force behind the tariffs is that it at least makes sort of an indirect subsidy to force internal domestic production of fuels by something other than petroleum. The other point that I wanted to bring to you is that in our own internal sort of look at sucrose availability, meaning cane sugar, and where it would go, that there's still not enough cane sugar out there in the world to come through and convert to fuel, let alone the corn problem that is very real and issues the problem. Have you looked at sucrose availability and whether that can be used short-term or long-term for making a biofuel?
Well, I'm going to defer the question at the end of your comment to the second half, because I think we will have people up here who know a lot more about sugar-based ethanol prospects than do I. But I thought the two comments that I took you making about mandates and tariffs is that you need a certain amount of market size to incent innovation, and you need a certain sort of subsidy or incentive, if you wish, in order to get started. And I don't disagree with that in principle. I think where we are differing is how large does that market have to be driven by mandates in order to provide that incentive? And my sense is we passed it a long time ago with respect to corn-based ethanol.
Certainly for corn, no question about it.
And
cellulosics, if you go back
okay. Now, I was just going to go to cellulosics. There's a nice slow ramp-up rate, as Ford pointed out. We've kind of called into question what mandates mean because the first-year mandate couldn't be met, so they had to unwind it, and that's obviously going to create some more confusion in the industry about sort of where we go. The tariff point, and this is something that attached to what Carl Hausman was saying too, underlines the first thing that I said in my presentation, that the U.S. biofuels policy is farm policy masquerading as energy policy. It is not energy policy. And I think for the long-term future of a biomass role in energy, we need to break that link and think about what a biomass industry needs. And as you yourself said, I think it needs a lot more R&D first before we worry about anything else.
We've got time probably for one last question. Department of Energy. And then we'll take a break and we'll come back with our international panel.
I was trying to hold my question to last just in case anybody else wanted to ask something, but since we have a little time, my question is about R&D, and there are third, fourth generation type biofuels that are being developed, algae-based or genetically altered bacteria, cyanobacteria, and so on and so forth, which have the promise of much greater yields for a given amount of area or volume that you might be growing them in. The possibility that they can use salt water or wastewater or sewage for their nutrients and their water requirements, and the fact that they wouldn't have to be grown on agricultural land, so that it would kind of get away from the problem of food crops and food security and water security. Can you comment on that and how we might get to a future where some of those were contributing to our fuel?
I'll go first. I'll go first. Give you time to think of an intelligent answer. I think algae actually has one enormous potential long-term advantage, and that is that evolution hasn't spent millennia developing defenses against conversion in the way that the cellulosic industry has, with lignin and cellulose being resistant to the kind of conversion to sugars that you need as the first step in this process. But I think we need to take one further step back and say, photosynthesis is not the most efficient process of converting solar energy into carbohydrate or into carbon. It is the most efficient process we have for building carbohydrates. There are other processes that take solar energy and convert them to useful forms of energy more efficiently. And if I were God allocating government R&D, I think I would start with some of those processes with my bigger bets and just make small bets on photosynthesis.
Now, Cargill is close to heaven, isn't that right? Ford, a thought?
Again, I think Robin and I want to emphasize that we are not in general hostile to biofuels or the development of new technologies, especially second and third and fourth generation technologies. And we hope that Congress and the administration continue to provide ample research funding for these investments in R&D to attempt to get the costs of these technologies down. I want to emphasize the distinction between investing in R&D with the objective of getting costs down and paying costs down in pilot plants that are running inefficiently. Those are two very different things. A second point, somewhat related to what Robin said, I'd like to emphasize is that I'm no physicist, but I understand enough about thermodynamics to know that, you know, when you extract and convert to BTUs coal and oil, what you're doing is you're taking millions of years of sunlight and temperature and pressure and converting them to energy, and because of the temporal accumulation of that energy over that period of time, you get a pretty big bang when you pour gasoline on the carburetor. By contrast, if you're dependent upon annual crops or even crops such as trees and wood waste, there is a far less steep entropic gradient that you're exploiting in order to get that energy. What does that mean? Well, it sounds like it sort of mumbo-jumbo, but what it boils down to is if you're going to substitute corn or switchgrass for coal and oil, you're going to need a lot of acres of corn and switchgrass to make an equivalent BTU substitution. And that's where the pressure comes when we begin to think either about agricultural crops or alternatively crops like switchgrass and even algae. The energy conversion ratios are going to be such that it will be tough to compete with this millions of years of accumulation of solar energy. So we just better face it. I'm not saying we can't and shouldn't move in that direction, but I think many people don't apprehend just how difficult it's going to be to take our current level of industrial activity predicated on the consumption of massive amounts of hydrocarbon fuels and convert them to renewables. That's going to be a very difficult transition.
Well, we're going to break for just a minute, take in this case, a second inning stretch. I'll ask the international panel to join us here at the front. And meanwhile, the good thing we've had is a clear demonstration that no matter how much food for thought, it has a very low carbon footprint. So please join me in a round of applause for outstanding